All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you had a good restful week last week for Labor Day, and we are back at it again here tonight. I see we've got not everyone here, but a good majority of the class here. So it's 6 o'clock, and we'll go ahead and get started. Labor Day really did mess with the rhythm of this class a little bit, and so I think I've worked out all the kinks in terms of any differences between the syllabus and what we have on our Canvas site, and so I think everything matches up pretty well now. So we should be good going forward, and if everything goes well, barring any illness or anything like that, we should be able to have our live sessions every single week until the end of the class. So that's where we are. Last week we talked, well, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the definition of effectiveness. Tonight we're going to get into differences between public and private organizations. I know you have covered before at different parts of the program, different times in the program, but tonight we're going to be looking at differences between public and private organizations and what those differences then mean for the measurement and achievement of effectiveness in our organizations. Next week, we'll then drill down into the unique environment of public organizations and talk about the impact of environmental differences, environmental challenges on the measurement and achievement of effectiveness. And so that's kind of where we are right now, where we're going then for next week. Remember that for next Sunday, I guess it is, September 18th, by midnight, you have 2 items that are due. One item that is due is your background paper. And again, that background paper is a brief 3 to 5 page paper wherein you will give me some basics of the problem or the issue that you are focusing on that's inhibiting effectiveness in your organization. Tell me what the problem or the issue is. Tell me who's involved in that problem or that issue, and why it's important to focus on that problem in order to try and remove it as an obstacle for effectiveness. And then also in that paper, you'll then be giving me a description of the problem or the issue. Where did the problem or the issue come from? Is it a relatively new problem, or is this something the organization's been struggling with for quite a bit of time? Have there been previous attempts to try and solve the problem? And if so, how effective have those previous attempts been? So you're basically just educating me on this problem or this issue for your organization in 3 to 5 pages. Provide a title page, and then again, you're giving me the basics of the problem, description of the problem, and then if you are using any external references, which some of you may need to, some may not, but if you are using external sources, please do give me a reference page with citations that are formatted according to APA 7th edition. But again, this is a very brief assignment. We're really looking at the quality over the quantity, so 3 to 5 pages certainly should be adequate to get the job done. So you have that due on the 18th by midnight. And then you also have your next Canvas essay that is due on the 18th by midnight as well. And that Canvas essay, you are going to highlight 2 major differences between your organization and a private sector organization that impacts upon effectiveness. And again, we're going to go through a lot of those differences here tonight. And if time permits, then the second half of class, we'll do some breakout groups where we'll deal with that same question to help you then prepare for your Canvas essay. I know that the 2 or 3 folks have already turned in their Canvas essays, and so thank you for that. It's always good to turn things in early, better early than late, but that will then be due no later than midnight on September 18th. So those are the 2 items you have due coming up on Sunday. So before we get into our information tonight, let me just ask, are there any questions anyone has about either of those 2 assignments, especially the background paper? Any questions at all? Okay. As you are putting finishing touches on, I know 1 or 2 have already been submitted, and I haven't gotten to those yet, but if you've already submitted your background paper, I'll hopefully be able to get to those by tomorrow and get you some feedback on those. But as you're working on that paper and on your Canvas essay, any questions emerge, as always, you can just shoot me an email, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Yeah, Cesar, go ahead.
No, yes, Professor, because I just logged in a couple of minutes late. So you mentioned that any questions about the 2 assignments, particularly the paper. I got the paper. Which is the first assignment? Which is the other one?
It's the Canvas essay, your essay on Canvas.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, my pleasure. Okay, so tonight, again, I know that you have talked about private versus public sector and differences between public and private sectors, perhaps ad nauseum in your time in the program. It is a very common topic that we talk about because the discipline of public administration oftentimes suffers from this, what we call a crisis of identity, where we sometimes have difficulty explaining how we are different than, how an MPA is different than an MBA, and how the study of public administration has some fundamental differences from the study of business administration. So I think it's important for us tonight to spend some time really fleshing out some of those differences, but always with an eye on what those differences mean for effectiveness. And so that's what's going to differentiate this discussion from some discussions you've had in previous courses about public and private differences. Now, one of the additional readings that you have is the article by Graham Allison. And again, you may have read that article in another class in the program. But the Graham Allison article is one of my favorite articles because I think he does a very nice job of really deconstructing some of the similarities and differences between public and private sectors. And his basic thesis is, again, our public and private sector, are they alike in all fundamentally unimportant aspects? So yes, there are some similarities, but are those similarities less important than we normally would think they would be? So I think what Allison does is he provides us with a nice backdrop for our discussion tonight, because Allison tells us that there are similarities and there are differences between public and private organizations. The similarities are those basic generic management theories. And so in generic management theorists will argue that public and private organizations have the same functions. That if you're leading and managing in a public organization, just like in a private organization, you have to hire people, you have to manage budgets, you have to engage in strategic planning, you have to deal with your environment. There are certain generic management functions that everyone does, regardless of the sector that they are in. I think what Allison does is he accepts that. And he says, yes, that is true. But his question then is, are those generic management functions, are those similarities all that important? Or are the differences more important than those similarities? And I think the basic thrust of the Allison article is, yes, there are these similarities in generic management theory between the two sectors, but it's how these functions are carried out that really differentiate the sectors. And it's really how those functions are carrying out, those differences, that are really more important than just the similarities in generic management theory. So it's not just that we all hire employees, it's how we do it in the public sector is fundamentally different than the private sector. We all know the protracted hiring process in the public sector. We all know the steps we have to go through whenever we go out there to fill positions in a public sector organization. We know about the vetting of our applicant pool. We know about the equity and diversity emphasis that's placed upon creating the most diverse applicant pool possible. We also know about merit-based hiring as opposed to at-will hiring. We know that when we are hiring people in a merit type of system, then we have to have empirical indicators for their ability to do the job. And we're held accountable for those empirical types of indicators, whether it be examinations, knowledge, skills, and abilities. But it's going to be a protracted hiring process. We have to put together our interview, our sample for our interview. We have to then interview those individuals. We then select the most qualified from that applicant pool. It may take 6 months, it may take 8 months, it may take 10 months, as opposed to the hiring in the private sector where it's at-will hiring can be done relatively quickly. We know how we manage personnel will be different in the public sector as compared to the private sector. We know that we have civil service requirements that we abide by in public sector organizations. We know that we have public employee unionization that we deal with in the public sector, much more so than what we're dealing with at-will employees in the private sector. We know budgeting is different in that the flow of our revenues will be different in the public sector as compared to the private sector. we're reliant upon appropriations for our revenues in the public sector. It's a much more stable revenue source as compared to in the private sector. We know that our strategic planning in the public sector is much more subject to what we call fire drills and intervention and disruptions. We know that we serve many masters in the public sector, and so therefore have less direct control over our subordinates and over strategic planning than you might have in the private sector. We know we have a much more varied environment in the public sector in terms of interest groups and the media, constituent groups than what you might see in the private sector. So even though we are doing the same functions, the difference is in how we are doing those functions in the public sector. And Allison's argument is that how we do those functions, those differences, actually more important than the similarities that we see in generic management theory. And so I think that creates a really nice backdrop for us, because what we can do is we can now then drill down into some of those differences in how we operate in the public sector versus the private sector, and what those differences then mean for our ability to, again, measure and then achieve effectiveness. So we know the essential distinction between public and private organizations is that there are different purposes for public organizations versus private organizations. We know in the world of a private organization, we're operating to try and make a profit. And if we don't make a profit, obviously we're not going to be in business very long. There is a bottom line. For a true government organization, there's oftentimes not that profit motive. There's oftentimes not that bottom line. So there are other purposes beyond just running a profit that we are interested in public organizations. We're interested in other values. We're interested in effectiveness. We're interested in social equity. We're interested in protection of individual rights. We're interested in political responsiveness and bureaucratic representation. And so we have different types of values and different types of purposes in our public organizations. When you have different purposes, obviously the way in which you measure your effectiveness in achieving those purposes will have to be different as well. We also know that public organizations come about and they get involved in the provision and production of goods and services because of the lack of a private sector element, this existence of market failures. And we've talked about market failures before in the program, I know. So you're familiar with the market failures when the private sector either cannot or chooses not to provide and or produce a good or service that is seen as something that's desirable or needed by society. So that creates this vacuum. And this good or service needs to be provided and produced. The private sector doesn't have an inducement to do it, and so therefore government gets involved. Sometimes what that means is that public sector organizations are providing and producing goods and services that are very difficult to measure. They don't have that very clear quantitative empirical bottom line that a lot of the goods and services have that are being provided and produced over in the private sector. We know that in the public sector, we are oftentimes providing and producing what we consider to be more public as compared to private goods. And we typically, in public administration, when we're talking about different types of goods and services, we typically kind of deal with it in a binary type of way, in that we have public goods and we have private goods. We would assume that the public sector is going to provide and produce public goods, and we assume private sector will provide and produce those private types of goods. The distinction between public and private goods really boils down to two different characteristics. We ask the question, does the good have exhaustibility, and does the good have excludability? So if it's a good that can be exhausted, meaning that one person consuming that good is going to use it up so another person cannot consume that good has exhaustibility. When a good has exhaustibility, it means that it's probably more along private goods as compared to being considered a public good. And the second dimension then is excludability. Can we charge people? And can we exclude people if they do not pay the price for those goods and services? Charlie, go ahead.
Thank you so much. No, I wanted to chime in simply because one of the things that I learned in the last book that we had, which was the Denhart book that we used with Dr. Franklin, was the idea of the new public management theory, which talks about the public sector being more business-like as far as quantifying efforts, like they do in the private sector. And I just started a job in the public sector for the first time ever. And my biggest fear was that a lot of my skills were not going to be transferable and that a lot of this stuff wasn't going to make sense. And through all of the research and the readings that I've been doing, it's really cool to see how a lot of those skills are actually transferable. And a lot of the concepts and ideas actually make sense also for the public sector. But it's like I'm constantly reminded, like, what are the performance measures that we use in the public sector so that we can quantify our effort? So like, for example, city will remain unnamed. Where I work, there are not a lot of performance measures that we use to quantify our efforts. And when we had our finance and budgeting class that we took with, I forget the name of the professor who we all really loved, we were able to analyze other cities' budgets. And there was a whole section with performance measures. And it's like, these are the things that we did with your tax dollars at work. And I thought that was so cool. So I'm just kind of bouncing off of what you're sharing, which is there are a lot of crossover. And for me, it's great because I understand it coming from the business side. So I appreciate that like theory and that mentality.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that. That's a great point. Where you're talking about those performance measures and budgeting, things like the new performance budgeting approach, or performance program-based budgeting. So that's where you get those types of performance indicators that perhaps in the past we didn't really have incorporated in our budgeting process in public sector organizations. And we try, because we want to be transparent. We want to show, here are the things that we are achieving with public taxpayer money. And so that's where we then incorporate those performance measurements into our performance-based budgeting process. A lot of local governments show that you've got your classical performance-based budgeting and your new performance-based budgeting, which is kind of the difference between outputs and outcomes. And so we've kind of moved today in public organizations more toward a focus, not just on outputs, but also then on outcomes, on the consequences of these things that we are paying for in our budgets. And so by incorporating that, I think you're right, there is that overlap then into the private sector where we are very interested in trying to measure those types of outcomes that we are getting from the money, public taxpayer money we are spending. And sometimes the problem we run into is sometimes it's difficult to measure performance for certain types of goods and services. So, the more public the good or service, perhaps the more difficult it is to have quantitative empirical measures than for the more private types of goods and services. And so I think that's why we oftentimes think when it comes to government intervention in the economy, if it's a good or service that has these public sector elements, then I think we're much more accepting of having the public sector involved in provision and or production, as opposed to if it has more private sector types of elements. So I think you're exactly right, Sharon. I think that's a great contribution, is that we are seeing more and more of those performance measures like we would see in the private sector being incorporated in the public sector, especially when we get to things like public budgeting and how we are managing public taxpayer money. I think the old dichotomy that we always talked about with either it's a public or a private good, as you may have talked about in your budgeting course, there's a gray area in between those two different types of goods. And there are some goods that have some private yet some public types of components to them. And so the other two goods you've probably talked about before in your classes are goods like total goods and common pool goods. And that total goods and common pool goods kind of fall in that gray area between a pure public and a pure private type of good. So once you get into a common pool good or a total good, then you have a lot more discussion and debate about, is it proper for government to be providing and or producing this good or service, or is this something that should be left to the private sector? We're talking about total goods. Obviously, we're talking about a good where it is excludable, but it's non-exhaustible. And so something like a toll road is excludable, and that if you don't pay the toll, you don't get to drive on the toll road. But once you pay the toll, absent congestion, everyone who pays the toll is allowed to then drive on the toll road. So it's excludable, but it's not exhaustible. With the common pool good, it's just the opposite of that. And so a common pool good, it is exhaustible, but it's essentially non-excludable, and that everyone should have access to natural resources. Everyone should have access to mineral pool rights and things such as that. But when you're talking about those gray area goods like toll goods and common pool goods, that's when it gets a little more blurred. the lines between public and private sector and what should be done by the public sector, what should be done by the private sector. But the upshot of this for us in our discussion of effectiveness and measuring performance is sometimes that we acknowledge it is more difficult to come up with quantitative or empirical performance measures for more pure public goods as compared to pure private goods, which are much more empirical to measure in terms of profit margins and things such as that. So it could be more difficult for us in the public sector with pure public goods to really be able to measure how well we are doing in terms of effectiveness in achieving our performance measures. Cesar, go ahead.
Oh yeah, just to piggyback on what you are saying, and also kind of what Charlie said before, that we're talking about key performance metrics. One of the things that came to my mind when I was reading the chapter for this class is yeah, in the reality in the public sector is a little bit more difficult to measure values, right? Different from what could be in the private sector. Coming from the private sector, I work in the private sector, it's easier to measure performance, for example, good customer service variable, even sales and the like. One in the public sector, you have things like, for example, environment. You know, many times an agent, how you can measure performance for a public agency regarding the environment. I mean, there are too many variables involved, and that's one of the main things that probably I think that impact the key performance measure when we compare both sectors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And you make a great point about the number of variables in the public sector. You know, whenever you're applying an analytical technique, the more variables you have, the more difficult it is to apply that technique. You know, even if you're doing a statistical technique like multiple regression analysis, when you do that, it's difficult when you have a lot of variables that you have to control, as opposed to if you're doing it with a much more limited set of variables. And you're right, our environment presents us with a lot of additional variables, and oftentimes those variables are very difficult for us to control because we're talking about influences from different groups and different individuals, and sometimes those groups and those individuals, it's difficult to predict how they're going to react to certain types of things, and so it is much more difficult for us to do that performance measurement in the public sector than perhaps we can do it in the private sector. And just to mention one other thing really quickly is that I know I've been talking about provision and or production, and I assume you're probably familiar with that distinction. Provision is giving the resources to then make the production process possible. Production is actually doing it, actually creating it. And that's kind of the difference between provision and production. Ben, go ahead.
All right, thank you. And I was going to make the point that I work in an industry that has very easy comparisons between public and private, being in the electric industry, because we, as a public sector utility, sit alongside PG&E, which is one of the really large private sector industries. And I can say from experience that we occupy a different space in offering the same service, and yet our measures of success and performance are very, very different and disparate. So you can have similar industries. It's hard for you to say, well, there's not really much point of a for-profit library, but there are arguments for one or the other in a private or a public utility, and what one measures on success on one side may not be the same measurement that other people would apply. And I think we have seen some of those challenges play out in our state of California, and then seen things like the CPUC created and all these other entities that are trying to then bring back some of the deficiencies on one side on the private sector and trying to get them to increase more of their more public sector like characteristics.
Yeah, and that's a great example, because you have one type of service, but you have public versus private. So it gives you a really nice comparison, because it's the same type of service. It's just being done either by a public or a private sector organization. And you're right, you have public utilities commissions that are there to try and make sure that these types of essential services are available to as wide of a population as possible. And so you're not rationing out these types of very important, very life-saving types of services. And so that's where you end up getting that regulation of a private entity because of the type of good or service that they are providing. And I think that's an excellent example. And so, yeah, we do that. And that's a nice case study because, again, you can hold the the good or service constant, and then just your basic difference is whether it's a public or private sector organization. And from a research perspective, that's what we try and do in order to actually see those differences. So that's an excellent example. And a lot of these goods and services that are being produced, especially in the public sector, they've got a lot of those externalities as well, is that there are these unintended consequences that occur whenever these types of goods and services are being produced. And I'm assuming your budgeting class, you probably talked about positive versus negative externalities and some examples of positive and negative externalities. The interesting aspect of positive and negative externalities is that goods that produce a positive externality tend to be underproduced, and those that produce a negative externality tend to be overproduced. And so if you have a negative externality such as pollution, and so for the world of the economists, you've got your widget factory and they're creating their widgets, and in creating the widgets, they pollute a river. That's a negative externality, and obviously that's something that government wants to get involved in to try and clean up that pollution, because there's no market incentive necessarily for the widget company to clean up that pollution. And so what government will get involved in, they'll get involved in the process of trying to either come up with a way to pay for that negative externality to clean it up, or to reduce the production of the good that is resulting in that negative externality. Goods that produce positive externalities tend to be underproduced because of free riders. And so if you're a company, you're going to determine how much to make based upon the demand for that good that you are creating. Well, free riders who are getting this positive externality but are not directly paying for the good are not going to be taken into account in terms of the decision-making calculus of the company of how much of this good to produce. And so that's where government sometimes gets involved in trying to enhance the production of this good that is then resulting in this positive externality, this good type of consequence for the public at large. So when you've got the public sector involved, oftentimes some of the goods and services that are being provided and produced end up causing these externalities, and that then argues for more government involvement and more public organization involvement in provision and or production. But once government gets involved, and once we see public organizations getting involved in provision and production, that's when we start to run into some political rationales for continued or enhanced government involvement. And this theory is political theory known as expectancy theory. That once public organizations are involved in provision and production, then members of the public start to expect that they will continue to be involved. So the federal government is now giving me this benefit or is producing this good. It's going to be hard for government to pull back from producing it, because I now come to expect government to be producing that good or that service. Oftentimes what will happen is, in the event of a crisis, you will see the response be that governments get involved in enhancing their provision and production of goods and services. Once the crisis is over, we oftentimes don't go back to the status quo before the crisis, but we continue to have government providing and producing those goods and services, because politically, that's what the public have come to expect. And sometimes that expectancy theory, that's why we see this upward trend I'll do it this way, this upward trend in terms of the amount of provision and production being done by public organizations. Leah, go ahead.
Would an example be like the vaccines, when they had, I think before President Biden took in, when they had that Operation Warp Speed and they were trying to speed up the production of vaccines, and then when the next president came in, President Biden, and then they had this Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson, and when the government got involved, we just saw this entire increase of production. And I was monitoring how many vaccines were created before and how many vaccines were created afterwards. So would that be an example of that political rationales for the expectation theories?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great contemporary example, is that we came to expect that it was a crisis, and so federal government gets involved in trying to enhance the production of vaccines. And so we've now come to anticipate that government will be involved in that manner. And so I think in I hate to say in the next pandemic, but there probably will be another pandemic in the future. But in the next pandemic, I think we now have a heightened expectation for the role of the federal government in another Operation Warp Speed and getting involved in the production of vaccines for whatever future pandemic comes along, because that's the expectation now. And as those expectations go up, then we anticipate government will continue getting involved in that type of provision and production. And I think, again, that's a really good rationale and for why we see public organizations perhaps doing more than what we may have seen them doing in the past. And you can see that as you look through, like, I teach federalism a lot, and you go back through the history of federalism, you'll see throughout the 1800s, through eras that we call competitive and cooperative federalism, we see a pronounced role for the federal government in provision and production, whether it be regulation of food safety, regulation of workplace safety, regulation of pharmaceutical medications. A slow and steady progress whereby the federal government got more and more involved in regulation. And I think one of the reasons why the federal government then never returned to its prior level is because of expectancy theory. People came to expect that the federal government would have certain safety provisions and protections for food and workplace safety and things such as that. And so they come to expect that. And so it's really difficult for the federal government, even if it wanted to engage in retrenchment and move away from providing and producing and regulating those types of goods and services. And so I think we've got a lot of good reasons why we have public provision and production, or at least the involvement of the public sector in provision and production, and an increasing involvement in provision and production by the public sector as well. When the public sector gets involved in provision and production, as we had said before, it brings with it different values than perhaps if it was left only to the private sector. And the public sector, obviously, we go beyond efficiency. Efficiency should be one of our values, but we go beyond that. In this class, we're very interested in effectiveness, but we also have social equity as one of the core values of public administration. We have protection of individual rights as a core value. We have political responsiveness as a core value. Representative bureaucracy is another core value. And so all these core values of public administration are more numerous, and they're also oftentimes more difficult to measure than just simply efficiency, doing more with less, how much profit you are generating. And so we have more nuanced types of values that we are concerned with when we are a public organization. That means that, again, measuring performance in the public sector is also going to be more nuanced. And it's going to be more difficult for us to measure performance and effectiveness because we are balancing all these values. And sometimes, as we'll see, these values oftentimes will come into conflict with each other. Again, the whole moral of the story here is it makes it more difficult for us to measure effectiveness in the public sector oftentimes than what we see in the private sector. Mark Moore makes the argument to us that it's important for public managers to be proactive in trying to put forth and trying to support and advocate for these different values beyond just efficiency. That whenever the public sector gets involved in provision and or production, there's a good chance that the public intervention into the economy means that there will be some private sector resources that are being displaced. Whenever the public sector displaces private sector resources by getting involved in provision and or production, the value of that public involvement must outweigh the costs of those private sector resources that are being displaced. There must be some net value in some instance from public intervention. Sometimes that net value is not seen just through efficiency alone. It could be that, yes, maybe a private sector corporation could do this more efficiently and could do this on a cheaper basis than a public organization. But once you get beyond efficiency, how about those other values? So does the public intervention help with social equity, achieving social equity better than leaving it to the private sector? Does public intervention help protect individual rights more than leaving it to the private sector? Does public intervention help with political responsiveness more than leaving it to the private sector? As Moore tells us, it's about more, no pun intended, than just efficiency. It's about all these other values. in the public sector. And we have to incorporate all these values into our consideration of performance measurement as well as our achievement of effectiveness. So it's not just all about efficiency. It's not just all about trying to do more with less. That is one value, but we have a lot of other competing values as well. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the subsequent slides here because I know this is all information that you're familiar with from your time in the MPA program. This next slide, it's the Lindblom basic typology of different types of organizations, running from private enterprises on the far right at the top down to government agencies on the bottom left. And so you're basically gradually transitioning from a private enterprise to a private corporation that's subject to government regulations, to a private corporation that gets significant funding from government contracts, heavily regulated private firms like privately owned utilities, like we were talking about before, the private corporations that get a majority of their money from government contracts, to private nonprofit organizations that are totally reliant upon government contracts for their existence. You then shift down to government programs or agencies operated largely through purchases from private vendors, government-sponsored enterprises, public corporations, and then finally your pure government agency, your pure public agency. The important thing about this Lindblom typology is it just reminds us that there are gradations, that sometimes we are mistaken in just saying, well, it's a public or it's a private organization. There are a lot of gradations between a pure private enterprise and a pure public government agency. And we need to keep those gradations in mind as we are talking about measuring effectiveness in those different types of organizations. Another way to look at the difference is comparing public ownership to public funding. So who owns the organization? Where does the funding come from? Top left, obviously, is your pure public organization. Public ownership, funding coming from public sources such as taxes. Your bottom right, pure private organizations, private ownership, funding coming from sales and private donations. And then you have your mixture. So top right, you have privately owned, publicly funded, such as defense contractors who get the vast majority of the money from government contracts. Bottom left, you have publicly owned, you have privately funded. These are oftentimes your more government corporations, such as the U.S. Postal Service. So again, just another way to distinguish between public and private organizations. When we're measuring effectiveness, it's good to keep in mind the ownership versus where the funding is coming from. Here's another one that compares organizations based on political versus economic authority. So on your y-axis, you have economic authority. On your x-axis, you have political authority. The higher you go, obviously, on economic authority, the closer you are to being a pure private sector organization. The further to the right you go on political authority, the closer you are to being a pure government agency, pure public organization, and then all your different manifestations in between. Again, compared based upon if it's authority coming from the political world or if it's authority coming from the markets and from the economic world. Another way to do it, compare ownership, funding, and the mode of social control. So who owns it, where's the money coming from, and who controls it? Is it being controlled by society as a polyarchy, or is it being controlled by market forces, as you would see in more private sector types of organizations? They can see the examples of each different type of organization based upon ownership, funding, or mode of social control. So again, just some different ways that we can compare these organizations to each other, again, for the purpose of taking their unique characteristics into account and determining how we're going to measure effectiveness, how we're going to engage in performance measurement. Now, as we talked about, and we'll talk about a lot more next week, the environment is something that really distinguishes public and private organizations. And to understand effectiveness in public and private organizations, we have to understand the differences in the environment that surround these public and these private organizations. John Gauss, which you run into, we may have mentioned him 2 weeks ago, I don't remember, but John Gauss is a very famous public administration theorist who is known for his ecology of public administration. And in the ecology of public administration, John Gauss makes the argument that to understand an organization or the behavior of members of that organization, you have to first understand the environment that surrounds that organization. John Gauss was very much of a natural systems theorist, and so he kind of viewed organizations as these living, breathing organisms, kind of like an animal or a person. And so to understand, or a plant, so to understand how a living organism thrives, you have to understand the environment that surrounds it. To understand how a plant thrives, you have to understand the amount of sunlight it gets, the food it gets, the water it gets, all those good things. So that's the environmental approach. And so we have to understand that the environments are different between public and private sector organizations. One major difference between public and private sector organizations, as we know, is the source of their funding and what they're reliant upon for their existence. Private sector organizations are reliant upon sales and reliant upon the money coming in from consumers purchasing their goods. For public sector organizations, they're oftentimes reliant primarily on government appropriations. Well, so what? You know, my favorite question in all classes is so what? Well, so what? But the so what here is it makes a difference in terms of what they do and how those organizations behave. So the argument goes that the more reliant you are on government appropriations, the more stable the source of your revenue. The more stable the source of your revenue, the less imperative there is for you to try and reduce costs and to operate efficiently. The more you're reliant upon sales, the less stable your revenue source, and the less stable your revenue source, the more important operating efficiency becomes for you. And so that really becomes your focus more so in the private sector than perhaps in the public sector. Sometimes there's lower efficiency in allocating resources whenever you are reliant upon government appropriations as opposed to sales and money that's coming in from consumers purchasing your goods. And so that's why sometimes we see the stories about government waste, because if you have the stable appropriation source coming in year after year after year, you're not that concerned about how you're allocating those resources. Now, again, there are limitations to that, obviously. And obviously, in poor fiscal times, whenever we're taking the knife to the government budget and we're doing across the board cuts, then efficiency becomes a little bit more important. There's less availability of these clear market indicators in the public sector as compared to the private sector. We also know we have a lot more limitations and constraints placed upon us in the public sector. We have our many masters approach in public administration, where we are held accountable to the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. That many masters theory means that we have more limitations and constraints placed upon us as public managers in our operations and our procedures. We have less autonomy in making choices in some respects than our private sector counterparts, because we are being held accountable to this proliferation of formal administrative controls. We have more masters that we are serving in the public sector as compared to the private sector. So again, a much more varied and much more challenging type of an environment. In addition, that environment, not only do we have a legislative, executive, and judicial branch that we're held accountable to, but we also have influences coming to us from interest groups, client groups, constituent groups, public opinion. And so we have to be responsive to those groups as well. And that has to be taken into account whenever we're measuring the effectiveness of our organization. How we respond to those constituent and client groups could have an impact then on our flow of appropriations, because we need to have that type of support from those groups in order to maintain our appropriations and to maintain the authorization for our programs and the organizations themselves. We know the transactions between the organization and the environment can be different in the public sector as compared to the private sector. As we've already said, public organizations oftentimes deal with programs that create a lot of significant externalities. Those significant externalities make it very difficult for us to have traditional measurements of effectiveness. If we have people in society who are benefiting from a good or a service but are not paying the cost of that good or service, it becomes difficult for us to identify all those quote unquote free riders and to identify the actual amount of benefit that those free riders are receiving from consuming these goods and services. It's hard to take those into account in terms of our calculations of the amount of demand for a good or a service. We don't have the same market indicators that you may have over in the private sector. Sometimes the programs that we are administering in the public sector are done on a monopolistic basis. And you know, from the economic world, you can have monopolies and you can have monopsonies. A monopoly is where you have one producer. A monopsony is when you have one consumer. And so sometimes these are government monopolies where it's the government that's the only producer of a good or a service. We know when you have a monopoly, then you have a lack of competition. That lack of competition then can have impacts upon quality of the goods and services being produced and provided, as well as the cost of those goods and services as well. We know when the public sector is involved in provision and production of goods and services, the public sector has more of a symbolic significance in that it's kind of what we call an expository role, in that in the way in which government is doing its business, the way in which government is providing and producing these goods and services, it's kind of role modeling for the rest of society in terms of how this should be done in very much of a normative way. And so we are very concerned about ethical adherence. We're concerned about making sure that we are spending money in the legally appropriated ways, so that we are kind of giving this symbolic measure, if you will, to society of this is how it should be done, and it's being done with the utmost adherence to ethics, which again plays into our calculation of performance and effectiveness. We know there's a great deal more scrutiny of public managers than private sector counterparts. We're all very familiar with that. And we know that we have unique expectations in the public sector for treating everyone on a fairness basis, being responsive, being honest, being open, and being accountable. It's what a lot of ethics authors will refer to as the shock of the ethics upgrade that we oftentimes have in the comparison between private and public sector organizations. We know how open we need to be in the public sector, especially here in a state like California. You know, we have all these limitations such as the Brown Act, and we have public records requests, and we need to be very open in terms of how we are providing and producing these goods and services. So we have to balance efficiency with being open and transparent. And sometimes being open and transparent means, by definition, you are going to be less efficient in terms of the allocation of your resources in providing and producing your goods and services. We know in a couple of weeks we're going to spend time talking about the impact of mission and goals and values on measuring effectiveness. In the public sector, we know we have greater vagueness, intangibility, and difficulty in measuring our goals and our performance criteria. We know our goals are oftentimes very debatable and also value laden. We know we have a greater multiplicity of goals in the public sector as compared to the private sector. Again, we have goals like efficiency, accountability, openness, political responsiveness, fairness, due process, social equity. These are all important goals that we're trying to achieve, but we also know that not only do we have a lot of those goals, we know those goals conflict with each other. As we said, trying to enhance due process and making sure we're protecting the rights of individuals, that would be a slower process. And that slower process could then come into conflict with demands for efficiency. We know that public scrutiny means that sometimes we're going to be a little bit less efficient than we would be if we didn't have those types of transparency and openness types of requirements. So a lot of different goals and conflict between those multiple goals. We also know that we face a lot of interruptions in the public sector, what we like to call our fire drills. And so because of the greater public scrutiny, we have a lot of those interruptions, and sometimes it's difficult for us to gain momentum toward achieving a goal because we're always being interrupted in the progress toward the achievement of that goal. We're always responding to a crisis that comes up because someone has to respond to the crisis, and if there's no incentive for the private sector to do it, then it's left for public organizations. We also know that there are limitations on our decision-making autonomy and flexibility in the public sector because all those constraints and limitations we talked about earlier on. We also know that we have, as public managers, less control and authority oftentimes over our employees as compared to the private sector. We know that we have civil service requirements that we have to adhere to. We know that we have collective bargaining agreements that we have to be knowledgeable of and adhere to those as well. And so we've got more constraints. And so we don't have the same flexibility and autonomy in managing our personnel as you might have managing an at-will employee in the private sector. Obviously, the upshot of that is that we don't have the same control and authority. It's going to be more difficult for us to direct people toward the achievement of goals and to direct people toward doing the types of things that need to be done to make our organizations effective at achieving our goals. As Susanna said, it does feel like you're putting out fires all the time. It makes it difficult for you to build that momentum toward the achievement of your goals. The delegation of authority and power is sometimes more difficult in the public sector because of the limitations on the authority of public managers. If you're a public manager and you have all these limitations on your authority to manage your personnel, one resource that you sometimes have is information and control over activities. And so sometimes you want to maintain that information, maintain that control over activities as a resource because you lack all these other resources that your private sector counterparts have. And so sometimes you're more reluctant to delegate this power and authority to subordinates because having that power and authority really is a resource that helps fill the void left by not having all these other resources that private sector counterparts may have. We know that politics oftentimes intervenes, and we have intervening elections. And those intervening elections could mean a change in party, and so therefore we may have political appointments that will be made, and people from who are used to be the heads of agencies and departments. Once you have an intervening election, they are no longer heads of those agencies and departments, and you get new heads of the agencies and departments. Again, makes it difficult to build any consistent momentum over a long period of time. So the traditional argument in the literature is that all these types of constraints on the administrative authority of public leaders makes it difficult for them to be entrepreneurial and to be entrepreneurial in achieving managerial excellence. Now, we do have some conflicting findings in the literature in that some managers and some leaders have been entrepreneurial and have found a way to be entrepreneurial managers as opposed to just being brokers, and have had some of that success in terms of achieving goals and objectives. But it's kind of overcoming those obstacles in order to be that successful. We also know when we look at the differences between public and private sector, we know that the structure of organizations matter, and that the structure of public organizations will sometimes look different than the structure of private organizations. Public organizations oftentimes have a relatively rigid organizational chart, and it tends to be your Max Weber type of tall hierarchical system, your classic organization theory approach to your organization structure. That oftentimes creates a very regimented system that kind of depresses the ability of people to be creative and entrepreneurial, creates a lot of red tape, and all that red tape then again is an impediment to try and achieve our goals and our objectives. Now, the counter to that argument is that there are a lot of private sector organizations that also have red tape, and there are also the private sector organizations that have these very regimented, very Weberian types of organization structures as well. I think the argument is just we tend to see them a little bit more in the public sector as compared to the private sector. Sometimes in private sector organizations, it's easier to do things like cross-functional training programs than it might be in the public sector because of our rigid position classification systems. And if you're going to have a cross-functional training program, sometimes that means that, at least temporarily, people may be working outside of their description. Or if they're working outside their position description, that's then grounds for a grievance with the union and a meet and confer, and then it really becomes very difficult to do that type of cross-functional training. In terms of strategic decision-making processes, obviously, as Allison tells us, you have strategic decision-making in both the public as well as the private sector. But the problem, as we said before, and as Susanna said in text chat, you've got a lot of these fire drills. You have a lot of these crises that you're responding to all the time that makes it difficult for you to get around to actually implementing those strategic plans that you have put together. So it's just more difficult to implement those types of strategic decision-making processes. We know the incentive structure is a lot different between public and private sector organizations. We know compensation in the public sector is driven primarily by position classification. So oftentimes, if you want to reward an employee monetarily for good performance, it's difficult for you to do that, especially if that person is at the highest step in their grade, their pay grade in the position classification system. In order for them to get paid more, you would have to have a reclassification study done. And you don't want to have reclassification studies done to pay people more. You only have reclassification studies done if the actual nature of the job has changed. And if you do a reclassification study of one position, then you kind of have this slippery slope and this cascading effect where everyone else is going to want to have a position reclassification study done as well. And so it's difficult for us to link up performance with extrinsic incentives such as pay and promotion. Much more difficult in the public as compared to the private sector. Pay for performance, we see it a lot in the private sector. We don't see it quite as much, obviously, over in the public sector. And extrinsic rewards for public employees are sometimes not as important as they are for private sector employees. You know, James Perry is one who's done a lot of work in this, looking at the motivators for public versus private sector employees and intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators. And a lot of the literature argues that public employees place a lower valuation on monetary incentives, but a higher valuation on public service types of motivators. You know, kind of that higher level self-actualization type of motivator from somebody like Abraham Maslow, as compared to just extrinsic motivators like extra pay. Now, we have tried to incorporate some pay for performance mechanisms into the public sector. When we have done that, sometimes it hasn't worked that well. One good example of that, if you've had human resource management before in the program, you're probably familiar with the Civil Service Reform Act. We also mentioned that briefly a couple of weeks ago. Civil Service Reform Act introduced bonus pay and merit pay into the federal bureaucracy. People who would join the senior executive service and would give up some of their civil service protections to join the senior executive service would be eligible for bonus pay, pay based upon how well their organizations are operating, how well their organizations are achieving their goals and objectives. People lower in the general schedule, below the senior executive level, so GS 13 through 15 employees under the Civil Service Reform Act would be awarded with merit pay, again, if their performance contributed to achievement of goals and objectives in the organization. That was our attempt at the federal level to incorporate pay for performance. Problem was Congress never fully funded bonus or merit pay. So they promised bonus and merit pay, but then they never made good on their promise. And so I think what happened in the Civil Service Reform Act, because Congress never came through with its promises of bonus and merit pay, it had a chilling effect for employees in terms of their view of pay for performance. Because even if they may have liked the idea of pay for performance, they didn't trust that the pay was actually going to come through. Then there's also the argument about job satisfaction and how satisfied and how engaged are public employees as compared to private sector employees. Later on in the term, we're going to go through the Merit Systems Protection Board, their annual study on employee engagement at the federal level. And one thing we'll see that over the past several years, employee engagement and satisfaction has increased over the past several years. And it's increased pretty much across the board for the vast majority of federal agencies and federal departments. So satisfaction and engagement is on the increase in the public sector, but when you compare it to private sector organizations, it still tends to lag a little bit behind the satisfaction and engagement levels in the private sector. But even though public engagement lags and satisfaction lags behind the private sector, it still is relatively high. And so you're talking about a difference of a couple percentage points, but still you're looking at most federal agencies, you have engagement scores well above 75, 80% of your employees. And so usually we're still pretty engaged, just sometimes not quite to the same level as in a private sector organization. All of this adds up to give us the argument that sometimes in the public sector, we tend to be a bit more cautious than we might have been in the private sector, and perhaps not as innovative or creative as if we didn't have all of these types of constraints and all these different types of limitations. The upshot of that, obviously, is that if we are being more cautious and we're not being as entrepreneurial, then sometimes it makes it more difficult for us to achieve efficiency and effectiveness in the public sector. However, we have seen examples of organizations that have been effective and have been efficient over the past several years. And that's something that you certainly talked about in your first Canvas essay, giving examples of organizations that you found to be effective and efficient as compared to some other organizations that you found to be very ineffective and inefficient. I think what we're looking at in public administration today is very much my favorite answer to everything, which is it depends. It depends upon the individual organization and the culture within that organization. Some organizations, even though they're in the public sector, do have a very creative entrepreneurial organizational culture where they do reward employees for being creative and innovative. Some other organizations are more traditional, Weberian organizations. They do not reward creativity. They reward kind of the Frederick Taylor doing the job in the one best way. So it really does depend upon the individual organization. That's a theme that you're going to be working on over the next several weeks as you are fleshing out the details of your alternative solutions for the problem that you're identifying in your background paper. The problem that your organization is facing will oftentimes be the result of the culture in that organization. So your organization may face this problem, but another organization may not. How you address that problem in your organization will probably be different than how you would address it in another organization because of these cultural differences between organizations. It's very much of a contextual approach to studying public administration, and I think the contemporary public administration literature really takes that contextual approach that depends upon the unique cultures within each organization. So as you are identifying the problem for your background paper, and then in the future, as you're identifying your 3 alternative solutions, always keep an eye on the culture of your organization. So if you are identifying a solution that is really a game changer, it's a solution that's going to require a complete reorientation of the way in which your organization is operating on this issue, think about the culture. And will the culture of your organization support that type of a whole-scale change in its operations? Or do you have to be a little bit more realistic and scale back that alternative solution to make it match the more conservative culture within your organization? So always use the culture of your organization as the touchstone for everything you're doing in the assignments in this class, because it's really that culture that will help dictate what is practical and what is realistic in trying to enhance the effectiveness of your organization. Again, I know we went through this information very quickly because I think we can, because I know you've covered differences between public and private organizations, maybe ad nauseum up to this point in the program. But when we're doing it here in this class, we're always doing it with an eye on what does it mean for effectiveness. So what do the differences between public and private organizations mean for how we measure and how we achieve effectiveness? So what I thought we would do in the last part of class tonight is to do our breakout groups. You've listened to me talk for about an hour now, and so I think it's time for you to be able to talk and participate and not have to listen to my voice for a while. So what I thought we'd do is it's a little bit after 7. Let's go ahead and take a really quick break. Let's say we'll take a break to about 7:15. Then we'll come back at 7:15 and we'll get into breakout groups, and I'll give you some time for each group to work on the following problem. Identify 2 differences between your organizations and private organizations that could affect the measurement and achievement of effectiveness in the organization. So let's take, again, about a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 7:15. When we come back at 7:15, I'll break you up into groups, and then you'll have about 20 or 30 minutes to work on this. Then we'll reconvene as a class, and we'll share what you came up with and look at similarities and differences in each group's responses. So let's go ahead and take a break, come on back at 7:15, and we will get into our breakout groups. Okay, we're back. Hope you had a good, albeit very brief break. Again, like I said, what we'll do is we will go into our breakout groups, and I figure we'll probably spend maybe about 30 minutes or so in our breakout groups. the job of each group obviously is to come to an agreement on two main differences between your organizations and private organizations that could have an impact upon measurement and achievement of effectiveness. And so what I kind of hope the groups will do is kind of come to a consensus on what the two main differences are that you see between your organizations and private organizations. And then also if each group could then select a spokesperson, because what we'll do is we'll do this until about 7:45. Then we'll come back together as a class at 7:45, and then you can share out your results, and we'll have a spokesperson from each group to share those results with the class. Okay, sound good? I have created 5 breakout groups and just randomly assign folks to breakout groups. Let me go ahead and open the rooms, and they can go into your breakout room. And again, we'll do this about 7:45 or so. Okay, so here we go. Okay, I think all the rooms are closed, so we should all be back in the main room now. So let's just, in the remaining time together, let's go ahead and share out what we had, what we came up with in each one of our groups. So let's start with, I guess, breakout room number 1. I think that was Andrew, Cesar, Hannah.
Yeah, so the two things that we came up with are the first one was personnel constraints. And so you know, some of the examples that we came up with is how performance management affects how people are compensated in the public sector. You know, you have all these rules that are in place on how pay increases happen, and it generally doesn't happen based on performance, where in the private sector it does, and that obviously affects the effectiveness of the organization if employees don't feel like they're getting compensated correctly. And then the second one was how government services are provided based on public needs versus the private sector, which when they're providing services to individuals, it's based solely on that organization making money. And again, where in the public sector, that organization is providing services based on what the public needs, not necessarily if it's going to make that organization any money.
Very good, perfect. Thank you, Thomas. And you know, the personnel one is a major one we've talked about earlier. The second one is an interesting one as well, because when we're talking about public needs, you know, we're talking about the macro level, and a lot of private corporations make decisions based upon the choices of individual consumers. So it's kind of more of adding up of all those micro level preferences. But for public organizations, it's the macro level, and so you know, getting from that micro to that macro level sometimes is difficult in the public sector. So I think that's an important distinction. So great. Okay, thank you, Thomas. Thank you, room number 1. How about room number 2? I think that's Anna, Charlie, Aaron.
You want to go first?
You go first, Charlie.
Okay, no problem. We split it up in 2 people. I hope that's okay, Professor Powell.
Sure.
You know, one of the things we discussed, the differences between the private and public sector, and it's pretty obvious, but I think it's important to note that obviously in the private sector, you have profits. But in addition to that, not only is that easy to quantify, you can also quantify retention, which some people call it brand loyalty. And that's just the percentage of consumers or customers that you've retained that continue to buy your product or services. And I noted on there the fact that because you're in the private sector, you're able to source things differently, whether it's through a source code, whether it's through an 800 number that automatically shows you where the call came from, as far as like what medium we advertised in. So that's a lot easier to quantify. Whereas in the public sector, as we've discussed for the last hour, it's not as easy to measure performance. But with performance measurements in place, you are able to actually quantify things. And one of the things that I saw in the budget that I did my research on for our budgeting class for the city of West Hollywood, they actually have a page that talks about like your tax dollars at work, and every department had like these are the things we accomplished. You know, we paved 2,000 miles, not that many, 200 miles worth of, you know, streets. We did X number of this, we cut this many trees, we planted. And those are all ways of them showing and quantifying what they did and how their tax and how our tax dollars as citizens went to work. And then Anna had another example because we have two.
Yes, thank you. So the other one that we discussed was promotions and the differences in the public versus the private sector. In the public sector, promotions are typically based on an individual's seniority, whereas in the private sector, it's based on an employee's job performance and merit. And this can affect effectiveness because of turnover rates and retention rates. So with employees constantly changing, it's not always a good thing, but you know, in some ways it can be. And then also employees might leave their public sector jobs to go to the private sector so that they can promote quicker and so that their work could be acknowledged better. Whereas in the public sector, it might not be acknowledged.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Charlie. And yeah, in terms of, I think that's a really important point. Later on in the course, we're going to, and you may have been introduced to this theory before, but we'll talk about the bureau ideologies of Anthony Downs. I don't know if that rings a bell from any previous courses, but you know, you've got your climbers and your conservers. And that's a great example, is that if you're a climber and you're not able to get those promotions based upon your performance, they're based upon seniority, then you engage in exactly what Anna said, which is jumping. And you jump to another organization or you jump to the private sector. And that's a classic example of something that a climber would do if they are not able to get the promotion that they're looking for. And then what Charlie was talking about, I think is really interesting, the whole idea of the brand loyalty. You know, that gets us back to the whole monopoly versus competition type of argument, that you know, when you're in a monopoly and you only have the government that's doing the production, the provision, then you know, brand loyalty is not that important because you've only got one producer. In the private sector, brand loyalty is obviously important. So you've got that competition. You have another metric that you can use for performance. So I think those are great points throughout both Charlie and Anna. So thank you very much. Well done, room number 2. And we'll go on to room number 3. I think that's, oh, go ahead.
That's it. Awesome. Thank you so much. So our group chose personnel firing in conjunction to performance measurements, where you're less likely to achieve your organizational effectiveness if you're forced to keep employees that are unmotivated and unreliable, while the good employees end up get frustrated and move on to a different organization or company, or might just jump sectors altogether. One of our colleagues had an example. She works in the urban planning department. One of the employees was retired early. Luckily, she was union protected, but apparently she did no work during COVID because she did not have internet. So it just kind of goes to show it becomes complicated when you have certain limitations into just firing someone while in the public sector. You're not doing the job, you don't have internet, you're losing your job. And our next example was pay revenue, where the public always has a market to serve and they always have a constant revenue regardless of performance. The revenue is used to achieve the mission and value, which gives the public an edge compared to the private. It provides essential services, so it has more of a stability. While if you look at what happened during the pandemic, a lot of the private businesses just went out of business, while all of the government and public, also a lot of the nonprofits, had a stable mission to serve, which gave it a bigger edge. And we had someone in our group who works for a nonprofit and their student fees are constant. That's something that's always reliable for them. While someone who works in the private sector, you lose that income. Someone who works at a restaurant or owns a restaurant, restaurant's gone.
Great, thanks, Diana. And then two very important points, obviously. The first one, you're right, that sanctioning discipline can be much more difficult to do in the public sector as compared to the private sector. Also, in terms of that stability of revenue, in my full-time gig, I do a program director of a DL program, which is all self-support. And so it's interesting to see the contrast between that self-support program and the state-supported program, in that we do need to make our numbers in the self-support program, but the numbers aren't quite as important in the state support program because those state appropriations are coming in kind of irrespective of whether you have a 20 or 30% reduction in student population, that doesn't really matter. In the self-support program, you don't cover your overhead, you don't have a program. So very good points. All right, thank you, Diana. Well done. And thank you, room number 3. Room number 4.
So for our group, I think first we pretty much echoed the previous groups in talking about the pay for performance and disciplining procedures. You know, I think similarly speaking, like one of our team members had an example where she used to work at a parks department for LA County, and it's like there was a person who was basically embezzling funds, but you know, labor protections and everything like that, she just got moved to a different position rather than go through the route of trying to removing that employee. Gets harder in that end when employees don't perform. You know, we have a lack of a stick and a carrot to really, the range of options there are limited on the public sector, but also on the idea of measuring effectiveness. I think we talked about how, I guess for the public sector compared to the private sector, where you have very clear like benchmark indicators like stock valuation, price, market share. For a lot of service organizations in the public sector, the term effectiveness can be a bit more ambiguous. You know, for example, like you have a scholarship and internship program for an HR department in a county and they serve 30 students 1 year. Is that effective? You know, it's like there's like different definitions of what you could define as effective, and even comparing between cities or between jurisdictions, you know, different demographics and all that stuff play in. Is hard to basically compare and to really come to a definition of effectiveness. So there's some ambiguity on that end, but those are our 2 main points.
Thanks, Andrew. Again, very good points. It's, you know, the subjectivity in the public sector certainly does make it so much more difficult to measure performance. And, you know, I think what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of commonalities, but we're also seeing, again, some good support for the argument that Graham Allison made in his article that we started out the class with, that, you know, it really is more about, it's more about the differences in how those generic management types of functions are being done. Room number 5.
Yeah, so we talked about a couple of different things. The first thing we talked about was a couple of things in my world, actually. So I work in public works. So we have an engineering group that delivers projects. It's pretty black and white on the effectiveness of project delivery. You either deliver the project or you don't. There is some similarity in the private sector. If you're an engineer working for a private property owner, and you either deliver the project or you don't. So that was a similarity we talked about. And one of the major differences we talked about was we also have a water utility. And so we serve water to about 12,000 customers. And in the drought, having people reduce their water usage reduces budgets. So if you got to reduce by 20%, that reduces your revenue in some cases by 20%. For us, that just means reducing the amount of money that we spend on projects or, you know, services, things like that. For a private water company, they have different mechanisms they put in place during conservation to force people to conserve. But really what they're doing is they introduce new rates for people who use too much water, and to penalize them, they get charged a higher rate. Well, that penalty just so happens to make up for the reduction in revenue that they're losing from the conservation itself. So at the end of the day, they have to answer to their shareholders, and this is a tool that they get to use to be able to keep them happy.
Thanks, Kyle. That's an outstanding point. We don't really think a whole lot about that, but that's a great comparison between public and private. And that's something, you know, private sector can't do, is have those differential rates in order to make up for that lost revenue. And that's a great illustration of the difference between the sectors. So perfect. Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, room number 5. Again, you know, there are a lot of similarities here between the groups, but I think it really does underscore what Graham Allison told us, in that the differences are probably more important than the similarities, and the differences really are how we carry out those generic management functions in the public sector as compared to the private sector. For your Canvas essay, you're going to be doing this for your organization, you know, same type of thing you did in your group, only you'll do it for your specific organization. And then also, as you know, next Sunday, as we discussed, we have your background paper that is also due by midnight. So that's all I have for you for tonight. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for your work in the breakout rooms. I look forward to reading both your Canvas essay as well as your background paper. If you have any questions at all on either of those assignments, shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer any of those questions. Otherwise, then we'll be back at it again next Monday night, and we'll really start to drill down into the environmental analysis. And we'll really look at those substantive differences in the environments between public and private sectors. Okay? All right. Well, thanks, everyone. I wish everyone a really good week and look forward to reading your work. So take care, everyone. Talk
Good
to you
night,
next
all.
Monday.
Good night, guys.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Thank you.
Bye.